Late November 1944. Fraunhofen, Germany. The cold had settled into everything, the mud, the metal, the men. A Sherman tank sat motionless in the grey afternoon light, its engine silent, disabled by an American mine that had torn through its track. The crew had abandoned it hours ago, scrambling through rifle fire to reach friendly lines. Now the tank was alone, a steel monument to bad luck in a landscape already crowded with them. But this wasn't an ordinary Sherman. From 800 yards away, hidden in the skeletal remains of a farmhouse near Lone, a German anti-tank crew prepared their 88mm gun. They'd been waiting. An immobilized American tank was a gift, a chance to destroy enemy equipment before it could be recovered. The gunner sighted carefully through the optic, centering the crosshairs on the tank's glacis plate. The commander gave the order. The gun roared. The shell struck the front armor with a sound like a church bell hit by a leak. Sledgehammer. Smoke and dust obscured the target. When it cleared, the tank sat unchanged. No penetration, no fire. The German crew stared in disbelief. They'd just hit a Sherman at point-blank range with the most feared anti-tank gun of the war, and the tank had shrugged it off like rainwater. They loaded another round. This one struck the gun mantlet, the massive shield protecting the turret front. It ricocheted skyward, screaming into the distance. A third round hit the glacis again. Another bounce. The German commander's frustration turned to something closer to fear. What kind of Sherman was this? By the time they fired their 8th shot, 8 rounds from an 88mm gun that could punch through nearly any Allied tank at twice that distance, only one had penetrated, slipping through the side sponson to ignite the fuel and ammunition inside. The tank burned, but 7 of 8 shells had failed to breach armor that, according to everything the Germans knew about, American tanks shouldn't have existed. The crew who'd abandoned that M4 A3E2, the tank the Americans were calling the Jumbo, didn't know they'd just proven something extraordinary. They didn't know that their tank's survival, even in death, would become evidence in one of the war's strangest engineering stories. A story about a promise America had made to its soldiers, a promise to stop the unstoppable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The promise began with a lie, or maybe it was just hope dressed up as doctrine. In 1942, when the first Sherman tanks rolled off production lines in Detroit and Grand Blanc, American tank doctrine rested on a comforting theory. Medium tanks weren't meant to fight other tanks. That was the job of tank destroyers fast, lightly armored vehicles with powerful guns designed specifically for killing armor. Sherman tanks would support infantry, destroy fortifications, exploit breakthroughs. Tank versus tank combat would be rare, and when it happened, American numerical superiority and superior crew training would win the day. It was a doctrine written by men who'd never faced an 88. The German 88mm gun had started life as an anti-aircraft weapon, designed to knock bombers from 30,000 feet. But in the desert fighting of North Africa, German crews discovered that when you pointed a gun capable of reaching the stratosphere horizontally at a tank, the results were catastrophic. The high-velocity 88mm shell traveling at 2,800 feet per second, carrying the kinetic energy of a small car crash in a package the size of a wine bottle, didn't just penetrate armor, it obliterated it. Against a standard M4 Sherman, with its 51mm of frontal armor sloped at 56 degrees, the 88 was surgical. At 1,000 yards, it could punch through the glacis plate like it was made of canvas. At 1,500 yards, still no problem. Reports from Tunisia in early 1943 described 88mm shells entering the front of a Sherman and exiting through the rear engine deck, passing completely through the tank as if it were hollow. The Sherman's designers had known this. The engineers at the Detroit Tank Arsenal, at the Chrysler Defense Arsenal, at the Grand Blanc facility run by Fisher Body, they'd all known that the Sherman's armor wouldn't stop the heaviest German anti-tank weapons. But the doctrine said it didn't need to. The doctrine said American tanks wouldn't face those weapons often enough to matter. The soldiers who died in burning Shermans from Kasserine Pass to the hedgerows of Normandy learned differently. By early 1944, the lie had become impossible to maintain. Intelligence reports filtering back from North Africa and Italy painted an increasingly grim picture. The Germans were fielding heavier tanks, the Panther, the Tiger, in greater numbers than anticipated. Worse, they were deploying 88mm anti-tank guns, not as rare specialized weapons, but as standard equipment for infantry divisions. American tank crews were encountering them constantly. The mathematics were brutal. A Sherman could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panzer IV at reasonable combat ranges, but the Panzer IV could penetrate a Sherman at twice that distance. Against a Panther or Tiger, the disparity was even worse. The Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any practical range. The Panther could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 yards. The Tiger could do it at 3,000. American tank crews began painting their own grim calculations on the walls of bars in England that spring. 5 Shermans for 1 Tiger was the optimistic version. Some units whispered worse ratios. The tankers developed a bitter nickname for their vehicles, Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company whose advertising slogan promised lights every time. Shermans, the joke went, also lit every time. But there was a deeper problem, one that haunted the engineers more than the soldiers. It wasn't just that Shermans were dying. It was that they were dying before they could do their actual job. The invasion of Europe Operation Overlord, scheduled for June 6th, would require tanks to lead infantry through the Atlantic Wall, break through the hedgerows of Normandy, and assault the Siegfried Line's fortifications. Those were infantry support missions, the exact role the Sherman had been designed for. But if the tanks burned before reaching their objectives, if crews bailed out at the first sign of German armour, the entire invasion could stall. In February of 1944, a memo circulated through the Army Ground Forces. It was brief, almost bureaucratic in its language. The subject line read, "Requirement for assault tank." The text explained that the upcoming European campaign would require a heavily armoured tank capable of supporting infantry against fortified positions. The tank would need frontal armour thick enough to survive close-range anti-tank fire, particularly from 88mm guns. It would need to reach the battlefield, absorb punishment, and keep fighting. It did not say, "We need a tank that won't burn like a Ronson," but everyone who read it understood. The Ordnance Department initially proposed using the M6 heavy tank, a 37-ton beast with thick armour but dismal performance in trials. The Army Ground Forces rejected it immediately. The M6 was slow, mechanically unreliable, and already obsolete. There was also the T-26 heavy tank program, which would eventually produce the Pershing, but that wouldn't be ready until 1945 at the earliest. The assault tank was needed now, in time for D-Day. On March 2nd, an Ordnance Technical Committee meeting produced a different recommendation. Instead of developing a new tank from scratch, they would modify an existing design. They would take a standard M4A3 Sherman, the variant with the reliable Ford GAA V8 engine, and add enough armour to stop an 88mm shell. The proposal was simultaneously brilliant and desperate. Brilliant because it would use existing production capacity and supply chains. Desperate because no one was entirely sure it could be done. The basic M4A3 weighed 34 tons fully loaded. The proposed assault tank would need to weigh over 42 tons to carry the necessary armour. That meant adding 8 tons of steel plate to a chassis and suspension system never designed to carry it. The vertical volute spring suspension, the VVSS, that gave the Sherman its characteristic rough ride, would be pushed beyond its design limits. The transmission, the final drives, the track system, all would be strained past, applying their intended parameters. But there was no alternative. On March 23, 1944, the Ordnance Technical Committee formally recommended limited procurement of 250 assault tanks, designated M4A3E2, plus 4 pilot vehicles for testing. The E stood for experimental, though everyone understood these weren't experiments. They were urgently needed combat vehicles being rushed into production under the convenient fiction of experimental status. The contract went to the Fisher Body Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, a massive facility south of Flint that had been building Shermans since January of 1942. Fisher Body was a division of General Motors, and before the war, they'd specialized in manufacturing car bodies, the elegant curves of Cadillacs and Buicks. Now they built tanks on assembly lines designed using principles perfected in Detroit's automotive plants. The engineering challenge was deceptively simple. Take a standard M4A3 hull, weld 38mm thick rolled armor plates to the glacis and upper hull sides, weld additional plates to the lower hull front, replace the standard differential housing with a massive cast unit almost twice as thick, design an entirely new turret with 152mm of armor on all sides, front, rear, left, right, making it one of the most heavily protected turret designs of the entire war. The result would be a Sherman with frontal armor equivalent to a Tiger I heavy tank, better than equivalent actually, because the Jumbo's armor was properly sloped, providing even greater effective thickness against incoming shells. On paper, it looked straightforward. In practice, it required solving hundreds of small problems that multiplied into larger ones. The added armor changed the tank's center of gravity. The suspension had to be reinforced. The tracks needed extended end connectors, duckbills, to distribute the increased weight and prevent the chorus tank from sinking into soft ground. The transmission gear ratios had to be modified because the engine, though powerful, was now pushing 8 more tons of mass. And there was the testing. In late March, the Ordnance Department directed the General Motors Proving Ground to conduct endurance trials with a standard M4A3 loaded with ballast weights to simulate the assault tanks anticipated for 82,600-pound combat weight. The test tank, a Ford-built M4A3 fitted with extended end connectors to reduce ground pressure, was photographed on January 18th, before commencing a 500-mile endurance course over varied terrain. The engineers watched nervously. If the suspension failed, if the transmission seized, if the final drives broke under the strain, the entire program would collapse. There wasn't time to redesign the chassis. The invasion was less than 3 months away. The tank ran for 500 miles. The suspension groaned. The springs compressed, nearly flat. The crew reported that hitting bumps at speed was like being inside a steel drum beaten with hammers. But nothing catastrophic failed. The final report concluded, no abnormal failures were encountered. It therefore appears feasible to convert a medium tank into an assault tank with a weight of 82,600 pounds if only limited operation is to be encountered. That phrase, if only limited operation is to be encountered, was the engineering equivalent of a prayer. The M4A3E2 would need to survive long enough to complete its assault missions. After that, if the suspension wore out, if the transmission needed replacement, if the tracks had to be changed every few hundred miles, that was acceptable. The tank wasn't designed for sustained campaigning. It was designed to get American infantry through German defenses without burning. In April, Fisher Body began retooling their production lines, in a move that demonstrated both the urgency and the pickings. Desperation of the situation, the government waived normal testing and inspection requirements. A memo sent to Fisher in late March stated that, in order to expedite delivery of the M4, a 3E2 assault tanks, certain requirements of applicable specifications will be waived for the total of 254 vehicles. Translation: build them as fast as you can, and we'll trust you got it right. The first M4A3E2 rolled off the line in May. By July, all 254 had been completed, produced in just over 2 months, at a rate that would have seemed impossible before the war. Each tank weighed 42 tons. Each carried a crew of 5. Each bore the weight of a promise that this time American armor would hold. On June 8th, serial number 50326, one of the pilot vehicles was shipped to the Chrysler Tank Arsenal Proving Ground in Detroit for endurance trials. The tank, loaded with weights on each side to simulate a fully crewed and equipped vehicle, was driven over obstacle courses designed to replicate battlefield conditions. The suspension held. After the Detroit tests, serial number 50326 was sent to Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland for ballistic testing. Aberdeen was where the real answer would come, not from calculations or metallurgical analysis, but from actual shells striking actual armor. The testing crews set up targets at varying ranges. They loaded captured German 88mm anti-tank guns with their standard armor-piercing ammunition. They fired. The results were documented in a series of photographs dated June 26, 1944, showing M4A3E2 Tom, serial number 50360 on Aberdeen's test course, its armor pockmarked by shell strikes. The official reports were classified, but the evidence was visible. The armor held. At combat ranges, the Jumbo could survive hits that would have destroyed a standard Sherman instantly. But there was something the test reports couldn't capture, something that wouldn't become clear until the tanks reached Europe and met the enemy. The tests at Aberdeen used stationary targets, careful measurements, controlled conditions. Combat was different. Combat was an immobilized tank sitting in the mud near Frunhoven, while a German crew fired 8 times in growing frustration. Combat was the difference between what armor could theoretically stop and what it actually stopped when the shells came from unexpected angles in bad weather, with desperate men on both sides. The M4A3E2S began arriving at the New York port of embarkation in mid-August. By September 8th, 208 had been shipped to Europe. The initial batches arrived at Cherbourg around September 22nd, offloaded from transport ships onto the docks of a port that had been fought over just 3 months earlier. On October 14th, the U.S. First Army received the first 36 tanks. 15 went to the 743rd Tank Battalion, 15 to the 745th, 6 to the 746th. The tankers who received them were skeptical at first. The Jumbo looked heavier, slower, less maneuverable. The crews called it exactly that, the Jumbo, because it looked like a Sherman that had been hitting the weight room. Then they went into combat. The 743rd Tank Battalion, supporting the 30th Infantry Division, received their Jumbos in early November during the push toward the Ruhr River. The battalion was already blooded from Normandy, where they'd landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day, losing half their DD tanks in the surf. They knew what German anti-tank guns could do. When the first Jumbo took an 88mm hit and the crew walked away, it changed something fundamental. It wasn't just that the tank survived, it was that the crew stopped flinching. Tankers who'd spent months calculating which path offered the least exposure, who'd learned to bail out at the first explosion, suddenly found themselves leading advances instead of following them. Near Alsdorf, Germany, on November 27th, a photographer captured a Jumbo from the 743rd moving through rubble. Sandbags covered the glacis, held in place by wire mesh and camouflage netting. The crew had added extra protection even though the armor was already proof against the weapon they feared most. Old habits died hard, but they were advancing. That was the critical thing. The tank was moving forward, toward the enemy, instead of burning. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from Wehrmacht units facing American armor in November and December of 1944 contain puzzled references to new heavy Sherman tanks that standard anti-tank weapons couldn't penetrate. Some reports mistakenly identified them as a new American heavy tank model. Others noted correctly that they appeared to be modified Shermans, but couldn't understand how the Americans had added so much armor without completely redesigning the vehicle. What the Germans were witnessing was the answer to a question the title of "This Story Poses but Doesn't Quite Capture." There was no single suicidal pressure test that made Sherman armor stop 88mm shells. Standard Shermans never could stop them, and that was always known. What happened instead was more complex and more human. American engineers, facing the reality that their doctrine had been wrong and their soldiers were dying, built a tank that could survive. They did it quickly, pragmatically. by welding more armor onto an existing design until the numbers worked. The M4A3E2 wasn't elegant. It was heavy, slow, hard on its suspension, expensive to maintain. It represented the triumph of necessity over theory, of practical engineering over doctrinal purity, and for the men who crewed them, it represented something simpler, a chance. The chance that when an 88mm shell came screaming across 800 yards of frozen German farmland, you might survive the hit, you might keep fighting, you might make it home. That was the promise, and unlike the doctrine that preceded it, this one held. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell softly through the pine trees, muffling sound, turning the world into shades of grey and white. American units stretched thin across the line had settled into what they thought would be a quiet sector. A place to rest, refit, absorb replacements. The kind of quiet that made men careless. At 5:30 in the morning, the forest erupted. Over 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The sound was apocalyptic, a continuous thunder that shook snow from branches and sent wildlife fleeing in terror. Then came the tanks, hundreds of them, panthers, tigers, king tigers, followed by thousands of infantry pushing west through the snow. Hitler had gambled everything on one last offensive. The goal was Antwerp, the vital port through which most Allied supplies flowed into Europe. If the Germans could split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, they might force a negotiated peace. It was desperate, probably impossible. But Germany was beyond rational calculation now. The 743rd Tank Battalion, still recovering from the brutal fighting along the Siegfried Line, found themselves pulled into the maelstrom. On December 18th, they withdrew into Belgium near Malmedy, reorienting to face an enemy they'd thought was finished. Their opponent was the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the elite of the elite, equipped with the newest German armor and staffed by fanatics who believed this was their last chance to change the war's outcome. The fighting around Malmedy, Stavelot, La Glaise, and Stoumont became some of the most confused and desperate combat of the entire war. Units became separated in the snow, roads clogged with vehicles trying to move in opposite directions. Radio communication broke down. Tank commanders fought battles they couldn't see the edges, of engaging enemies that appeared from tree lines and vanished into the white, and the jumbos kept fighting. One engagement, never officially documented but recorded in the memories of survivors, involved a single M4A3E2 from the 743rd, holding a crossroads near Stoumont for 6 hours. The position was critical. Losing it would have opened a direct route for German armor into the American rear. The jumbo took 11 hits from various German anti-tank weapons. Panzerfausts struck its sides, blasting away the sandbags and scarring the armor but not penetrating. Long-range fire from a Panther, probably a 75mm gun, but possibly an 88 hit the turret front 3 times. All 3 rounds ricocheted. The tank finally withdrew when it ran out of ammunition, having fired every 75mm round and every coaxial machine gun belt it carried. The crew reported to their company commander that the tank was still operational, just empty. They refueled, rearmed, and went back into the line. That became the pattern. The jumbos weren't invulnerable. Mines could immobilize them. Close-range hits could find weak points. Mechanical failures could disable them. But they were survivable in ways standard Shermans weren't. Crews developed an almost superstitious confidence in their armor. They took risks that would have been suicidal in a regular Sherman. They led attacks instead of supporting them. They drew fire deliberately, knowing they could probably absorb it, letting lighter tanks maneuver while German gunners wasted ammunition on their frontal armor. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 37th Tank Battalion, part of the 4th Armoured Division, received their jumbos just in time for the relief of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division and attachments had been surrounded in Bastogne since December 20th, cut off, low, on ammunition, running out of medical supplies. The weather had been too poor for airdrops. The situation was desperate. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armoured Division broke through the German encirclement. Leading the column was M4A3E2, serial number 3083084. The crew had painted a name on the gun barrel: Cobra King. Cobra King reached Bastogne's perimeter first, smashing through a roadblock and linking up with the defenders around 4:45 in the afternoon. The moment was photographed, filmed, turned into propaganda, but what the cameras didn't capture was the journey getting there. Cobra King had been hit multiple times on the approach, including at least 2 strikes from German anti-tank guns that would have destroyed a standard Sherman. The armour held. The crew kept driving. The tank would survive the war and decades later be restored, eventually ending up in a museum in Brussels, its name still visible on the barrel, a monument to the breakthrough at Bastogne. But Cobra King was just one tank, one story among hundreds. By late January of 1945, when the Ardennes offensive finally collapsed and Allied forces resumed their eastward push, the US First Army had lost 22 jumbos, the Third Army had lost 8, the Ninth Army had lost 6, 36 tanks destroyed out of the roughly 250 that reached Europe. Those numbers require context. Standard Sherman losses during the same period were catastrophic: hundreds destroyed, many irreparably. The jumbo loss rate was significantly lower, not because they were held in reserve or used cautiously, but because they were thrown into the worst fighting and survived what killed other tanks. A report compiled after the Ardennes battle analysed jumbo performance in detail. The conclusions were striking. When a jumbo was lost, it was almost never because the frontal armour failed. Losses came from mines, from close-range flank shots, from mechanical breakdowns in air race, the brutal cold. From ammunition fires started by hits that penetrated the turret ring or other weak points. But frontal hits from 88mm guns, the weapon that had terrorized American tank crews for 2 years, failed to penetrate jumbo armor at combat ranges. The Fraunhofen incidents, documented in photographs and after-action reports from the 743rd Tank Battalion, provided the most dramatic evidence. The first jumbo, knocked out in late November near the village, took 4 88mm hits from about 800 yards. 1 round bounced off the glacis plate, 2 bounced off the mantlet. The 4th, and this was crucial, didn't penetrate through the armour. It entered through the telescope aperture, a tiny weak point in the otherwise impregnable mantlet. Even then, it was less a failure of the armour than a demonstration that no protection is perfect. Aim small enough, hit precisely enough, and every tank has vulnerabilities. The second Fraunhofen incident was even more remarkable. An M4A3E2 struck a mine, immobilizing it. The crew bailed out correctly, following doctrine. The Germans, wanting to prevent the tank's recovery, proceeded to fire 8 88mm rounds at the stationary target from 800 yards. 8 shots at a non-moving target at what amounted to medium range for an 88, 7 failed to penetrate. The 8th found the right sponson a side shot, not frontal, and ignited the fuel and ammunition. Photographs taken after the engagement show the tank's glacis plate pockmarked with impact craters, the mantlet scarred by shell strikes, but the basic armour integrity maintained. One photo shows an 88mm hit on the glacis that obliterated sandbags but barely dented the armour beneath. The sandbags, which crews had added because they didn't quite trust even the jumbo's protection, had been completely unnecessary. The armour would have stopped the round regardless. German. After-action reports from units that engaged jumbos reveal a progression from confusion to frustration to something approaching fear. Early reports from November describe heavy Sherman variants as a new threat requiring different tactics. By December, reports specifically warn against engaging these tanks frontally, recommending flanking maneuvers or withdrawal if flanking wasn't possible. By January, some reports simply note that standard anti-tank guns are ineffective against the new American armour. This was a remarkable reversal. For 2 years, German gunners had enjoyed devastating superiority against American tanks. 88mm guns could engage Shermans at ranges where the Sherman's gun couldn't effectively respond. Now, suddenly, there were American tanks that negated that advantage. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated. When your primary anti-tank weapon stops working, when you watch rounds bounce off targets that should be easy kills, it changes how you fight. But here's what makes the story complex. What prevents it from being simple triumph? There were only 254 jumbos. That's it. Less than 1% of total Sherman production. Less than 1% of the Shermans fighting in Europe. The vast majority of American tank crews still drove standard M4S and M4A3S with armor that couldn't stop 88mm fire. They still faced Panthers and Tigers and entrenched anti-tank guns with the same disadvantages they'd always had. The jumbo didn't solve the broader problem of American tank design. It was a band-aid, an emergency response to a specific need infantry support against fortified positions that happened to also provide the armor protection tankers had been begging for since Kasserine Pass. In early 1945, with the end of the war approaching, there were requests for more jumbos. The new version was to use the 76mm gun instead of the 75, providing both armor protection and better anti-tank capability. Some proposals suggested mounting the 90mm gun from the M26 Pershing on a jumbo chassis, creating a tank that could engage Tigers and Panthers on equal terms while still supporting infantry. None of it happened. By the time the requests reached production planning stages, the war was nearly over. The M26 Pershing was finally reaching Europe in meaningful numbers, providing the heavy tank capability the Army had needed since 1943. The urgency that had driven the jumbo program disappeared as German resistance collapsed. The last jumbos were lost in April and May of 1945 during the final push into Germany. Some were knocked out by late-model German tanks. Some broke down from accumulated wear on suspensions that had never been designed for 42-ton vehicles. Some were simply abandoned when they could no longer keep up with the advancing American armies. Their suspensions failed, their transmissions seized, victims of the weight they'd been asked to carry. But they'd done their job. Every jumbo that survived an 88mm hit, every crew that walked away from what should have been a fatal engagement, every infantry squad that advanced behind armor thick enough to absorb enemy fire, those were the victories that mattered. Not in grand strategic terms, but in the smaller, more human calculation of men coming home. So what's the real answer to the question posed by this story's title? How did one engineer's suicidal pressure test make Sherman armor stop 88mm shells? The truth is more complicated and more interesting than the title suggests. There was no single engineer, no dramatic personal test like John Garand firing an overloaded proof round to validate his rifle design. The M4A3E2 program was a committee effort, a bureaucratic response to operational necessity, involving dozens of engineers at the Ordnance Department, at Fisher Body, at Aberdeen Proving Ground, at the testing facilities in Detroit and Maryland. What they did wasn't revolutionary. They didn't invent new metallurgy or discover exotic armor compounds. They simply added more steel. They welded 38mm plates onto existing armor until the numbers worked. They designed a turret with walls thick enough to stop anything Germany could practically field. They tested it methodically, sent it to war, and watched it perform. The testing wasn't suicidal because it didn't need to be. The engineers knew the armor would work because the mathematics of penetration were well understood. An 88mm armor-piercing round could penetrate approximately 140mm of vertical armor at 500 yards. The jumbo's glacis plate, sloped at 47 degrees, presented an effective thickness of 149mm. The mantlet was 180mm thick. The math said it would hold, and the math was right. But calling it just mathematics misses something essential. The decision to build the jumbo represented an admission that American tank doctrine had been fundamentally wrong. It acknowledged that medium tanks would face other tanks regularly, that armor protection mattered more than the theorists had believed, that soldiers' lives were worth the cost and complexity of heavier vehicles. That admission came late. 2 years into the war, after thousands of tankers had died in under-armoured vehicles, after Kasserine Pass and Normandy and the Siegfried Line had proven what combat was actually like. The jumbo was an apology written in welded steel, a promise that someone had finally listened. The jumbos that survived the war had varied fates. Some were shipped back to the United States for study and eventual scrapping. Some remained in Europe, sold or given to Allied nations rebuilding their armies. A few ended up as monuments, their armour still bearing scars of combat. Cobra King, the famous Bastogne relief tank, was restored in the 2000s after being identified and rescued from a training range where it had been used for target practice for decades. The restoration team found shell impacts on the armour evidence of hits taken during the war and preserved them as part of the tank's story. The lessons learned from the Jumbo program influenced post-war American tank design, but not in the ways you might expect. The Army didn't build more assault tanks. Instead, they focused on developing tanks that balanced firepower, armour, and mobility more effectively than the Sherman had. The M26 Pershing, the M46 Patton, eventually the M48 and M60, each incorporated better armour protection as a baseline assumption, not an emergency modification. The German engineers who tested captured Shermans at Kummersdorf Proving Ground, who documented American automotive superiority with clinical precision, never tested a jumbo. None were captured intact early enough in the war for comprehensive testing. But German tactical reports from late 1944 and early 1945 make it clear they recognized what they were facing. American armor had evolved. The easy kills were becoming harder to find. For the soldiers who crewed jumbos, the experience remained visceral decades after the war. Veterans' accounts describe the sound of rounds bouncing off the armor, a metallic clang followed by the Doppler shift of the deflected shell, screaming away into the distance. They describe the feeling of invincibility, tempered by the knowledge that mines and close-range hits could still kill them. They describe leading advances they never would have attempted in a standard Sherman, drawing fire to protect lighter tanks, accepting risks because the armor gave them options. One veteran, interviewed in the 1990s, described it simply, "In a regular Sherman, you were always calculating. Where's the nearest? Cover. Can I get there before they fire? Is this road exposed?" With a jumbo, you stopped calculating and started fighting. That's all we wanted, a chance to fight instead of just die. That chance came at a cost. The M4 A3E2 was never going to be a perfect tank. It was too heavy for its suspension, too slow for exploitation operations, too specialized for general use. Its 75mm gun, chosen for infantry support rather than anti-tank work, left it vulnerable in tank versus tank combat against heavy German armor. The crews learned to avoid engaging Panthers and Tigers frontally, using their armor to survive until they could maneuver for flank shots or withdraw to let tank destroyers handle the threat. But perfection wasn't the goal. Survival was the goal. Getting American infantry through German defenses was the goal. And in those specific, limited objectives, the jumbo succeeded brilliantly. The final irony is that the tank America needed most desperately in 1943 wasn't built until 1944, and by then, the war's outcome was already decided. The jumbos arrived too late to change the strategic picture, too few in number to affect loss rates significantly, too specialized to become the standard. They were a footnote to the larger Sherman story, and might have been rendered in 254 examples. But to the men who crewed them, to the infantry who advanced behind them, to the families who got sons and husbands and fathers back because a tank's armor held when it should have failed to them, the jumbo was everything. In Fraunhofen, that burned-out M4A3E2 sat in the mud through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945. German and American forces traded control of the area multiple times. Engineers eventually recovered the hull for salvage, cutting it apart to study the shell impacts, to understand exactly how the armor had performed. They found 7 impact craters on the 10 frontal armor, 7 hits from 88mm guns that had failed to penetrate. The engineers took measurements, wrote reports, filed them away. The technical data would inform future designs, contribute to the slow accumulation of knowledge that eventually produced better tanks. But standing in that frozen field, looking at a burned tank that had absorbed 7 killing shots and failed only on the 8th, the engineers must have understood something the reports couldn't capture. This tank, this emergency modification, rushed into production to solve an urgent problem, had kept its promise. It had given its crew a chance. In the calculus of war, where chance is the rarest commodity, that was everything. The title of this story asks how a suicidal pressure test made Sherman armor stop 88mm shells. The answer is, it didn't, not like that, not in one dramatic moment. What happened instead was slower, more bureaucratic, more human. Engineers acknowledged a mistake. Factories retooled production lines. Metallurgists calculated thickness requirements. Welders joined plates. Drivers learned to handle heavier vehicles. Gunners learned to trust their armor. And somewhere in that process, spread across months and thousands of people, America built a tank that could stop the unstoppable. Not all of them, not even most of them, just 254, just enough to prove it could be done, just enough to save some of the men who climbed inside. In the end, that had to be enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning of December 21st, 1944. The frozen forests south of Malmedy, Belgium. A German soldier crouched in his foxhole as American artillery began its morning barrage. He had survived 3 years of war on the Eastern Front, witnessed the destruction of entire divisions at Kursk, and endured countless bombardments. Nothing had prepared him for this. The shells were exploding above his head, not impacting the ground as they should, but detonating in mid-air with surgical precision 20 to 30 feet above the snow-covered earth, showering down a lethal rain of shrapnel that turned his foxhole into a death trap rather than a sanctuary. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber pressed himself flat against the frozen dirt, feeling the hot fragments whistle past his helmet, watching men around him torn apart by steel that seemed to come from everywhere at once. That morning, examining an unexploded American shell in the pre-dawn darkness, Weber had seen something that defied his understanding of what was possible. The shell's nose contained what appeared to be a complete radio transmitter, roughly the size of a wine bottle, packed with miniature glass vacuum tubes. These delicate components had somehow survived being fired from a gun at forces that should have pulverized them into powder. Wehrmacht engineers had spent a decade concluding such a device was theoretically impossible. The Americans had not only built it, but were manufacturing them by the tens of thousands. This single realization would fundamentally alter German understanding of what America was capable of producing, and by extension, what Germany was facing. Yet the devastating truth that would haunt Weber and tens of thousands of German soldiers throughout the final months of the war was simpler and more terrifying. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. German troops would discover they were being destroyed not by every American shell, but by a calculated pattern they could neither predict nor counter. American artillery batteries were firing a deliberate mixture. Roughly 1 in every 5 shells carried the proximity fuse. The other 4 were conventional high-explosive rounds with impact or timed fuses, designed to crater the ground and destroy fortifications. This ratio was no accident. It was a calculated doctrine born from months of tactical analysis. The conventional shells forced German soldiers to take cover in foxholes, trenches, and bunkers. The proximity-fused shells, detonating overhead at precisely calibrated heights, killed the men hiding in those supposedly safe positions. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers could not predict which shells would explode on impact and which would detonate above them. Every incoming barrage became a lottery of death. Taking cover meant potential safety from impact rounds but guaranteed exposure to the airbursts. Remaining exposed might save you from the airbursts but meant certain death from the conventional shells. There was no tactical solution. No defensive position offered protection. No amount of experience or training could predict the pattern. The Wehrmacht, which had perfected combined arms warfare and prided itself on tactical sophistication, discovered it was fighting an enemy that had industrialized probability itself. The story of how German soldiers came to witness and fear this killing pattern began not in the forests of Belgium, but in the laboratories and factories of the United States, where in the summer of 1940, a group of American scientists were tasked with solving what every major power had concluded was an impossible problem. The National Defense Research Committee, formed on June 27, 1940, brought together leading American physicists and engineers under the direction of Vannevar Bush. Among them was Merle Tuve, a physicist whose brilliant but volatile temperament would drive a team that eventually numbered over 1,000 scientists and engineers. The problem they faced was straightforward to state but seemingly impossible to solve. German and Japanese aircraft were decimating Allied ships and ground forces. Conventional anti-aircraft guns required either a direct hit, which was extraordinarily difficult against a maneuvering target traveling at 300 miles per hour, or a timed fuse set to explode at a predetermined altitude. In practice, at the start of the war, it required approximately 20,000 shells to down a single enemy aircraft. Some estimates ranged as high as 100,000 rounds per kill. The concept of a proximity fuse had been considered for decades. Make a fuse that could detect when it approached a target and detonate automatically. Simple in theory, impossible in practice given the technology of the 1930s. Germany had explored proximity fuses as early as 1930, developing over 30 different designs, including acoustic sensors that would trigger on engine noise and electrostatic detectors that would respond to charged aircraft surfaces. By 1939, German researchers had concluded the technical challenges were insurmountable. Hitler's leadership issued directives in 1940, prioritizing projects that could reach production within 6 months to support the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. Germany's proximity fuse programs were among the casualties, though Rheinmetall Borsig would resume limited work in 1944, far too late to affect the war's outcome. The British had reached further. By 1939, researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had conceived of using a small Doppler radar system. They tested prototypes on rockets, which faced far less severe acceleration than gun-fired shells. But Britain's program was stymied by two critical obstacles. The cost was astronomical, and Britain's industrial capacity was already stretched to breaking. More fundamentally, they could not solve the miniaturization problem. The smallest vacuum tubes available, those used in hearing aids, were still far too delicate to survive the violent acceleration of being fired from a gun. By 1941, British scientists had working prototypes that functioned perhaps 50% of the time under ideal conditions. For military use, this was inadequate. The British shared their research through the Tizard mission when America entered the war, but it would be American scientists and American industry that actually made it work. The Americans took the British research and did what no other nation could. They actually built it. Not a laboratory curiosity, but a mass-produced weapon that could be manufactured by the millions. Tuve's Section T at what became the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University, established on March 10, 1942, in a rented Chevrolet garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, settled on a radio-based proximity fuse using Doppler radar principles. A miniature transmitter in the nose of the shell would emit radio waves at approximately 180 to 220 MHz. When these waves struck a target and reflected back, the frequency would shift due to the Doppler effect. When the reflected signal reached a predetermined frequency, indicating the target was within lethal range, an electrical circuit would close and detonate the shell. The theory was elegant. Making it work was another matter entirely. Consider the engineering challenges. The fuse had to fit into the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell, leaving room for 7 pounds of high explosive. Inside this space, engineers had to fit a complete radio transmitter and receiver, a power source, safety mechanisms, and a detonator. All of this had to function in extreme temperatures and survive storage for months. Most daunting of all, it had to withstand the shock of being fired from a gun. When a 5-inch shell is fired, it accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in roughly 20 feet of gun barrel. This creates an acceleration force of 20,000 times the force of Earth's gravity. Every component experiences a crushing force equivalent to being hit by a sledgehammer. The shell then spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it passes through the rifled barrel. And after surviving this violence, the delicate electronics had to function perfectly during the few seconds of flight time before reaching the target. James Van Allen, a young physicist who joined the Applied Physics Laboratory in April 1942 as a founding member, faced the task of developing what the team called rugged vacuum tubes. He started with miniature tubes that Raytheon and Sylvania had developed for hearing aids. These were designed for the Raytheon, gentle environment of sitting in someone's pocket, not the violence of artillery fire. Working with Sylvania Company engineers, Van Allen redesigned the tubes from first principles. The glass envelopes were thickened and carefully annealed. The internal filaments and grids were redesigned with shorter spans and heavier cross-sections. The tubes were potted in wax inside the fuse body, which cushioned them against shock. Every aspect was tested by firing complete fuses from a vertical gun into the ground at the Naval Proving Grounds in Dahlgren, Virginia. The soft earth caught the shells gently enough that researchers could recover the fuses and examine the tubes under microscopes to see what had broken. Through hundreds of test firings and thousands of design iterations, the team gradually developed tubes that could survive. By September 1941, they were achieving success rates above 50%. The Navy, desperate for any improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness, accepted this failure rate and authorized mass production tooling. The engineers were confident they could improve reliability during the production ramp-up, and they were right. By early 1943, reliability had climbed above 90%. But vacuum tubes were only one challenge among many. The fuse needed a power source. Conventional batteries were too large and had limited shelf life, particularly in tropical heat. Engineers developed a reserve battery that used a liquid electrolyte, kept separate from the battery plates until activation. When the shell was fired, centrifugal force spun the electrolyte into contact with the plates, generating electricity. This gave the batteries indefinite storage life. The fuse needed multiple safety mechanisms. It could not arm until well clear of the gun. It required protection against accidental detonation from radio interference or the ship's own radar. It needed wave suppression circuitry to prevent premature detonation when fired at low angles over water. Each safety feature added complexity. By the time development was complete, each proximity fuse contained approximately 130 miniaturized electronic components. The Mark 32 fuse for the Navy's 5-inch gun was 8 inches long and weighed just over 2 pounds. Inside its steel casing was perhaps the most sophisticated piece of miniaturized electronics that existed in 1942. On August 12, 1942, the light cruiser USS Cleveland conducted the first operational test in Chesapeake Bay. The target was 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft. Using conventional ammunition, downing these maneuvering drones typically required dozens of shots. Cleveland's gunners, firing proximity-fused shells, destroyed all 3 drones with just 4 bursts on the first day of testing. The Navy immediately cancelled the remainder of the scheduled tests and ordered mass production to begin. 5 companies were selected to manufacture the fuses: Crosley Corporation, Radio Corporation of America, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris. Production started slowly. By the end of 1942, factories were producing 500 fuses per day, but American industrial capacity was just warming up. By late 1943, production had reached 40,000 fuses per day. Over the course of the war, American industry produced more than 22 million proximity fuses at a cost exceeding $1 billion 1940s dollars. More than 100 factories participated in some phase of production. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati alone produced 5,259,113 fuses, representing 24% of total production. The company employed 10,000 workers operating continuously, 7 days a week, achieving peak output of 16,500 fuses daily. Sylvania Electric Products in Ipswich, Massachusetts, produced even more, manufacturing 5,683,332 fuses, while also producing 95% of all miniature vacuum tubes used across the program. Thousands of workers, many of them women, assembled the intricate components under conditions of absolute secrecy. Workers signed secrecy oaths and were searched entering and leaving the facilities. They did not know what they were building. Security surrounding the proximity fuse was second only to the Manhattan Project. The device was given the deliberately misleading code name VT Fuse, supposedly standing for variable time, to disguise its true nature as a radio proximity detector. The very existence of the fuse was classified. Even its use in combat was initially restricted to situations where there was no chance of a dud falling into enemy hands. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. 4 Japanese Aichi D-3. Dive bombers attacked a U.S. Navy task force. As the aircraft broke off their attack, Lieutenant Commander Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch battery on the cruiser USS Helena, fired 3 salvos of proximity-fused shells at the departing bombers. All 3 shells exploded near one of the aircraft, shredding it with shrapnel. The aircraft plunged into the sea. Helena's gunners had achieved what would have required dozens of conventional shells. They had downed an enemy aircraft without scoring a direct hit. Word of the success spread rapidly through the Pacific Fleet. By mid-1943, substantial quantities of proximity-fused ammunition were being shipped to Pearl Harbor. Combat results exceeded every prediction. In 1943, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire was credited with more than half of all Japanese aircraft downed by naval gunfire, despite proximity fuses being used in only 25% of shells fired. Admiral Arleigh Burke, later Chief of Naval Operations, recalled that when he served as Chief of Staff to Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the fast carrier task forces, proximity fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. The true effectiveness was demonstrated in a kamikaze attack on May 11, 1945, off Okinawa. 2 destroyers, USS Hadley and USS Hugh W. Hadley, came under assault from approximately 150 Japanese aircraft during Operation Kikusui No. 6, many loaded with explosives and intent on suicide runs. During approximately 1 hour and 25 minutes of intense combat, the 2 destroyers and 4 support craft faced overwhelming odds. Hadley knocked down 23 enemy planes before being hit by 1 bomb, 3 kamikazes, and 1 Oka rocket bomb. Hugh W. Hadley accounted for additional aircraft before being hit 4 times by suicide planes and left dead in the water. Both ships survived despite catastrophic damage. The verdict on proximity-fused ammunition in this action was indispensable. But for most of the war, the Pentagon strictly forbade use of the fuse over land. The risk was too great that a dud shell would fall into enemy hands. German or Japanese engineers might reverse engineer the technology or develop countermeasures. If Germany equipped its anti-aircraft guns with proximity fuses, intelligence analysts estimated bomber losses could increase by 300%. The strategic air campaign might become impossible. So the fuses were used only over water, where dud shells would sink beyond enemy reach. When a dud proximity-fused shell landed on Sicily during the invasion in July 1943, headquarters dispatched a special patrol to recover it before German forces could find it. This absolute security restriction began to crack in June 1944, when Germany unleashed the Vosne flying bomb against London. Launched from sites across the English Channel, the V-1s approached at speeds of 400 miles per hour, faster than many Allied fighters. Small, fast, and arriving without warning, they were extraordinarily difficult to intercept. From June to late August 1944, Germany launched over 9,000 V-1s against Britain. The pilotless missiles inflicted tens of thousands of civilian casualties. British defences initially could destroy only 17% of the V-1s that entered the coastal gunbelt. The situation was desperate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill authorised use of proximity fuses in anti-aircraft guns defending Britain. Modified fuses were rushed into production, specifically calibrated for the small, fast V-1s. British and American anti-aircraft guns along the coast were equipped with proximity-fused ammunition, working in conjunction with new radar systems and fire control computers. The effect was dramatic. Within 4 weeks, the destruction rate climbed to 74%. During one day in late August, 82% of incoming V-1s were shot down. Churchill later stated that the proximity fuse made possible the successes that anti-aircraft command was obtaining. The Vosne campaign demonstrated beyond doubt that the proximity fuse was war-winning technology, but it also meant the secret was partially compromised. Thousands of fuses were being fired over land. The risk that seemed so unacceptable in 1943 now had to be weighed against military necessity. In December 1944, that calculation changed completely. On the morning of December 16, 1944, more than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last desperate offensive in the West. The Germans struck through the Ardennes forest, aiming to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The offensive took the Allies by complete surprise. Within days, German forces had driven a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied lines. The weather was terrible, with heavy snow and thick clouds that grounded Allied air power. German commanders felt safe from artillery fire because poor visibility made accurate observation nearly impossible. They were wrong. On December 16th, the same day the offensive began, Colonel Oskar Alfred Axelsson, commander of the 406th Artillery Group, faced an agonizing decision. German forces were assaulting the 38th Cavalry Squadron near Monschau. The lightly armed cavalry desperately needed artillery support. Axelsson had just received a new type of ammunition, proximity-fused shells, codenamed POSIT. But Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had not yet authorized their use over land. The secrecy restrictions were still technically in place. Axelsson decided the emergency trumped the restrictions. He ordered his gunners to fire the proximity-fused shells. The effect on German forces was devastating. For the first time in the European theatre, American artillery was firing airbursts with perfect consistency, regardless of visibility or terrain. Each shell exploded 20 to 50 feet above the ground, precisely calibrated for maximum effect against personnel. The fragments spread in a cone-shaped pattern that covered an area far larger than a ground burst. Foxholes provided no protection. The shrapnel rained down from above, penetrating even log-reinforced bunkers. German soldiers who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front had never experienced anything like it. They could not hear the shells approaching due to the high velocity. The first warning was the explosion overhead. On December 19th, 3 days into the offensive, Eisenhower formally requested authorization to use proximity fuses without restriction. On December 21st, all limits were lifted. But here the story takes a turn that German soldiers would find even more psychologically devastating than the airbursts themselves. American artillery doctrine did not call for every shell to carry a proximity fuse. The tactical manuals specified a deliberate mixture. For anti-personnel fire missions, American batteries were instructed to load approximately 20% of their shells with proximity fuses and 80% with conventional impact or timed fuses. This ratio was the result of extensive testing and analysis. Fire 1 proximity-fused shell, then 4 conventional shells. Repeat the pattern. The conventional shells served multiple purposes. They cratered the ground, destroyed fortifications, cut communication wires, and most importantly, forced enemy soldiers to seek cover. The proximity-fused shells then killed those soldiers in their cover. From a German soldier's perspective, the pattern was undetectable and therefore unpredictable. Standing in formation during a barrage meant certain death from conventional shells. Diving into a foxhole might save you from the impact rounds, but left you completely exposed to the airbursts that detonated overhead with no warning. Deep bunkers offered no advantage. The shrapnel came straight down through log roofs that were designed to protect against horizontal shell fragments. Trees provided no cover. In fact, proximity-fused shells detonating above the forest canopy created additional fragmentation as they shattered tree trunks and sent wooden splinters raining down alongside the steel shrapnel. One American artillery officer, surveying a position after a proximity-fused barrage, noted that the forest appeared to have been topped by the sweep of a giant scythe. Tree trunks were shattered and torn. Almost every tree was severed about 40 feet from the ground. Klaus Weber, the German soldier who had examined the unexploded shell that morning, would survive the war and decades later describe his experience to American historians conducting oral history interviews with former Wehrmacht personnel. The airbursts were terrifying, he recalled, but what broke us, psychologically, was the randomness. You could not predict which shells would explode on impact and which would burst above you. Every barrage became impossible to survive through anything except pure chance. It was like being forced to play Russian roulette continuously. Your skills meant nothing. Your experience meant nothing. You simply waited to discover whether the next shell would let you live. Weber described watching a veteran sergeant, a man who had survived 4 years of warfare, including Stalingrad, simply refuse to leave his bunker during an American barrage. The sergeant had calculated, correctly, that remaining in cover gave him perhaps a 20% chance of being killed by an airburst, while leaving cover gave him a near certainty of being killed by the impact rounds. But refusing to move meant the unit could not maneuver, could not advance, could not even retreat effectively. The Americans had created a tactical paralysis. Another German prisoner, interviewed by American intelligence officers in January 1945, put it more bluntly: "Your artillery has removed courage from warfare. A brave man and a coward have exactly the same chance of survival under your airbursts. This is not honorable combat. This is industrialized slaughter. The Wehrmacht prides itself on individual valor and tactical skill. You have made both irrelevant." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Over the next 6 weeks, 200,000 proximity-fused artillery shells were fired in the European theatre. The impact on German forces was immediate and catastrophic. Lieutenant General George Patton later wrote to the War Department describing an action near the Sauer River. His Third Army had caught a German battalion attempting to cross with a concentrated barrage of proximity-fused shells. By actual count, 702 enemy soldiers were killed. Patton wrote that the new shell with the funny fuse was devastating. He predicted that when all armies had this weapon, they would need to devise entirely new methods of warfare. He added, "With evident satisfaction, I am glad that you all thought of it first." The morning of December 21st saw proximity fuses used in defense of Malmedy itself. SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny's Panzer Brigade 150, part of the elaborate German deception operation, attacked the town at approximately 4:30 in the morning. American artillery battalions supporting the defense fired proximity-fused shells with devastating effect. The airbursts so unnerved the attackers that some charged directly into American positions, seeking any shelter from the overhead explosions. The attack was repelled by afternoon, but the tactical impact went beyond the immediate casualties. German units began exhibiting what American intelligence officers termed artillery shock syndrome, a condition specifically triggered by the helplessness of facing proximity-fused fire mixed with conventional rounds. Forward observers reported that some German units were refusing orders to move during American artillery fire. Junior officers were unable to command their men forward. Experienced non-commissioned officers, who had led troops through years of brutal combat, were openly stating they could see no tactical solution to the American barrage patterns. The Wehrmacht had spent years developing infantry tactics based on fire and movement. Small unit leaders were trained to assess threats, identify covered approaches, and maneuver under fire. These skills had been honed through the campaigns in Poland, France, Russia, and North Africa. German small unit tactics were widely considered the finest in the world. None of it mattered against the mixed barrage pattern. Movement drew fire from the impact rounds. Staying in cover meant exposure to the airbursts. There was no tactical decision a junior officer could make that improved his unit's chances of survival. The only variable was luck. American intelligence reports from late December 1944 noted a dramatic shift in German prisoner interrogations. In earlier years of the war, captured Wehrmacht soldiers had typically expressed confidence in German equipment, training, and leadership, even when acknowledging that Allied material superiority was overwhelming. By January 1945, prisoners were expressing a fundamentally different assessment. They were not simply acknowledging American advantages in numbers or industrial capacity. They were describing a kind of warfare they could not comprehend and therefore could not counter. One German artillery officer, captured in mid-January during the reduction of the Bulge, provided a particularly detailed analysis during his interrogation. The officer, a career soldier who had commanded batteries in Russia and Italy before being transferred to the Western Front, began by acknowledging that German forces had always understood American material superiority. "We knew you had more shells than us," he stated through an interpreter. "We knew your logistics were better. We knew your artillery could fire more rounds per hour than ours. These were quantitative advantages. We could adapt to them through superior tactical positioning, through mobility, through the superior training of our officers. But your proximity fuse represents something different. It is not a quantitative advantage. It is a qualitative transformation. You have found a way to make every shell more lethal without firing more shells. You have automated precision that previously required skilled forward observers and perfect timing. And by mixing these shells with conventional rounds in a pattern we cannot predict, you have created a situation where no amount of German tactical skill makes any difference." The officer paused, then continued with what American intelligence analysts noted was a tone not of anger, but of exhausted resignation. "In Russia, we developed tactics to counter Soviet artillery. The Russians would fire massive barrages, but they were predictable. They concentrated fire on obvious targets. We learned to disperse, to use dummy positions, to move immediately after being spotted. Against British artillery in Africa and Italy, we learned different techniques. The British used precisely timed and targeted fire, but it followed observable patterns. We could predict where they would shoot next based on where they had shot before. Against your artillery, there is nothing to predict. The shells that explode on impact train us to take cover. The shells that explode overhead punish us for taking cover. The mixture means we cannot develop a tactical response. We can only endure and hope the barrage ends before we are hit." American interrogators pressed him on whether German forces had developed any effective counters. The officer shook his head. "Some units tried extreme dispersion, spreading out to the point where we lost tactical cohesion. This reduced casualties per barrage but made coordinated operations impossible. Other units tried staying constantly mobile, never remaining in position long enough for your artillery to target them. This exhausted the men and used fuel we didn't have. Some commanders tried digging deeper bunkers, but the airbursts penetrate anything except reinforced concrete, and we lack the resources to build concrete positions everywhere. There is no solution. We simply accept that when your artillery fires, a calculable percentage of our men will die, and there is nothing we can do to improve their odds." The psychological impact was measured in concrete military indicators. Desertion rates among German units facing American artillery increased dramatically in January and February 1945. These were not mass surrenders of demoralized units, but individual soldiers and small groups simply walking away from their positions during or immediately after artillery barrages. Self-inflicted wounds, the desperate act of soldiers shooting themselves in the foot or hand to get evacuated from combat, increased noticeably among units that had been subjected to repeated proximity-fused barrages. Medical officers at German field hospitals reported treating soldiers for what would later be recognized as combat stress reaction, but which German military doctors at the time diagnosed as cardiac problems or nervous exhaustion. The symptoms were consistent. Soldiers who had functioned normally under conventional artillery fire, who had endured the brutal combat of the Eastern Front, were experiencing uncontrollable shaking, inability to sleep, and panic responses when they heard any distant explosion. American artillery forward observers, monitoring German positions through binoculars and spotting scopes, reported observable changes in German behavior patterns after just 2 or 3 days of mixed proximity and conventional fire. German soldiers stopped using standard tactical movements. Instead of moving in organized groups from covered position to covered position, they moved individually and erratically, like frightened animals. This pattern, which observers initially attributed to general demoralization, was actually a rational adaptation to unpredictable artillery. By moving individually and randomly, soldiers reduced the chances that a single proximity burst would kill multiple men. But this adaptation destroyed military effectiveness. Squads could not maneuver as units. Platoons could not execute coordinated attacks. Companies lost cohesion. The Wehrmacht, which had pioneered combined arms tactics and small unit initiative, was being reduced to a collection of individuals trying to survive, rather than an organized military force trying to achieve objectives. German commanders attempting to mount offensives or even organized withdrawals found their orders increasingly ignored or executed with such hesitancy that tactical opportunities disappeared. A company commander might order an attack, but his platoons would advance so slowly and cautiously, so obsessed with avoiding American artillery, that the attack achieved nothing. A battalion commander might order a retreat to new defensive positions, but units would scatter during movement rather than maintain formation, arriving at the new position degraded and disorganized. Senior German officers, reviewing after-action reports and casualty statistics in late January 1945, identified the proximity fuse as a crisis requiring immediate response. Wehrmacht ordnance experts were ordered to examine any unexploded American shells that could be recovered. Technical intelligence units were tasked with determining how the fuse worked and whether countermeasures were possible. The problem was that by the time Germany prioritized this analysis, almost no intact proximity fuses could be found. The fuses had a reliability rate above 90% by late 1944. Of the shells that did fail to detonate, most buried themselves in soft ground or snow, making recovery difficult. The few that could be examined revealed a level of miniaturization and manufacturing precision that German experts found difficult to believe. One German ordnance officer's report, captured by American forces in March 1945, described examining a damaged but partially intact proximity fuse. The report noted that the fuse contained vacuum tubes smaller than any German manufacturer could produce reliably. Electronic components assembled with a precision suggesting automated rather than hand assembly, and overall construction that implied a manufacturing infrastructure orders of magnitude beyond Germany's capacity. The officer concluded that even if Germany had complete technical specifications for the fuse, which they did not, German industry lacked the capacity to produce them in militarily significant quantities. More fundamentally, he noted, Germany lacked the economic reserves to invest billions of Reichsmarks in a single weapon system, while simultaneously trying to maintain production of tanks, aircraft, and basic ammunition. This analysis reached the highest levels of German military leadership and contributed to a growing recognition that the war was militarily unwinnable. It was not simply that Germany was outnumbered or outproduced, though both were true. It was that America was solving problems Germany had concluded were unsolvable, and doing so at industrial scale. During the final months of the war, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany itself, the use of proximity-fused artillery only intensified. From January through March 1945, American artillery expended hundreds of thousands of proximity-fused shells against German positions. The pattern remained the same, one proximity fuse to every 4 or 5 conventional rounds. German soldiers learned to recognize the sound, or rather the lack of sound, that preceded an airburst. High-velocity artillery shells travel faster than sound. You hear the explosion before you hear the shell coming. With conventional impact rounds, this meant you heard a sharp crack as the shell hit the ground, followed by the whistle of fragments. With proximity rounds, you heard a distinctly different sound, a sharper bang from above, followed immediately by the rain of shrapnel. Learning to distinguish these sounds gave you perhaps half a second of warning. It was never enough. Wehrmacht tactical manuals, hastily revised in February 1945, attempted to provide guidance for units facing American artillery. The instructions revealed the impossibility of the situation. Units were told to maintain dispersal while somehow remaining capable of coordinated action. Soldiers were instructed to seek cover that protected against both impact rounds and airbursts, a physical impossibility. Officers were directed to time movements between American barrages, but American artillery was firing continuously in many sectors, providing no safe intervals. The manuals included one instruction that American intelligence analysts found particularly revealing. German soldiers were told that if they observed an unexploded American shell, they should mark its location and report it immediately to ordnance disposal teams, but under no circumstances should they attempt to examine or move it. This instruction implicitly acknowledged that Germany desperately wanted intact proximity fuses for analysis, but also revealed that previous attempts to recover them had resulted in casualties. American engineers had included anti-handling devices in some proximity fuses, making them dangerous to examine even when they failed to detonate during handling. The final accounting of proximity fuse effectiveness came in the casualty statistics. German medical records, captured after the war, revealed that wounds from artillery increased significantly as a percentage of total casualties in early 1945. More importantly, the severity of those wounds changed. Proximity-fused shells, exploding overhead, created wound patterns distinctly different from conventional artillery. Shrapnel entered from above, striking heads, shoulders, and backs rather than legs and lower bodies. Multiple fragment wounds became the norm rather than the exception. The mortality rate for soldiers wounded by proximity-fused artillery was significantly higher than for those wounded by conventional shells. By April 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, the proximity fuse had become so integrated into American artillery doctrine that its use was routine rather than exceptional. German forces facing the final Allied offensives were subjected to barrages where perhaps 1 in 3 shells now carried proximity fuses, an even higher ratio than the earlier 1 in 5 pattern. The psychological effect was complete. Wehrmacht units in the West were surrendering at unprecedented rates, with soldiers explicitly citing the impossibility of surviving American artillery as their reason for capitulation. The weapon that had seemed impossible to build had become the weapon that convinced German soldiers their cause was hopeless. American innovation had not just won battles, it had broken the will of an enemy that had believed itself tactically superior. The proximity fuse stood as testament to industrial might combined with scientific brilliance, proving that sometimes the most decisive victories come not from fighting harder, but from making the enemy's fighting impossible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.